Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into the chaotic, belly-flopping insanity of Georgian London. We're diving deep into a time when gin was the most popular drink, kind of like coffee at a tech startup, but with more vomit and questionable decision-making. Forget the sophisticated cocktail culture you dream of on a Friday night. This was a time when families were torn apart, not by drama, but by being plastered on the street corner, singing to the moon, or worse, the local constable. But before you cozy up in your favourite blanket and relax, take a brief moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy it, of course. And I'd love to hear in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. After all, it's always gin o'clock somewhere. Now, dim the lights, snuggle into your couch like a burrito, and imagine this. Have you ever questioned how far people will go for liquid courage? Is it possible to sing about the virtues of gin in front of your mother? What's the most embarrassing moment you've ever had after a drink? If gin was a person, would you be friends, or would you run for the hills? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in Georgian London, surrounded by sweet, intoxicating gin vapours, where your family is already trying to negotiate who gets the last drop. Good luck. Welcome to the early 18th century, where gin was more than a drink. It was a lifestyle choice. This was a time when distilleries boomed like rabbits after a rainstorm, with every alley offering a new excuse for forgetting about responsibilities. Your job, your family, and your sense of decorum. After all, who needs plans when you've got a shiny bottle and a dimly lit tavern? Imagine walking down a London street where each pub was like a siren, calling you into a mythical realm where all your cares could be drowned beneath a flood of clear liquid joy. But how did gin achieve such dizzying heights? It started innocently enough. Just a dash of juniper here, a touch of coriander there, and suddenly people found themselves in a delightful new state of mind. Until, well, they didn't. In a twist of fate reminiscent of every bad decision you've made after midnight, gin went from a genteel sipper's beverage to an obligatory part of the meal. Picture it. A family gathered for dinner, only to have Dad arrive at the table heralding the benefits of a pre-dinner gin, just to calm the nerves. By the end of that meal, recreational sipping had turned into competitive drinking. Just a charming little twist of fate for the economically disadvantaged. As that intoxicating spirit flowed through the streets, folks became merrily disjointed from common sense. Conversations about the weather turned into grand soliloquies on the virtues of gin, where the elderly neighbour could recount his life story in graphic detail, while somehow confusing a cat with the king's ambassador. The local constables... Oh, they were too busy contemplating the meaning of their own lives while covering the latest shenanigans of a slightly tipsy family, brawling over who got the last scrap of pork pie. So far as public order was concerned, gin was the uninvited guest who could really let loose, and who was there to stop it. With each sip, genteel society began to wobble on the fine line between revelry and ruin. The wealthy learned to appreciate their gin in glittering glasses, while the poor swilled it down from discarded bottles behind the local tavern. If you stumbled upon a family gathering in a London back alley, you could expect to find them uproariously regaling tales of past escapades, truths so twisted they could probably reel in a toothless shark. Celebrations were often held for absolutely no reason. Birthdays, bar mitzvahs, and the rare sunny Tuesday all became moments for a round of gin-fueled storytelling peppered with laughter and incoherent ramblings about the proportions of water to gin in your average cocktail. You'd wonder if there was even a drop of liqueur involved, or merely imagination liberated by spirit. And as families embraced this thrilling lifestyle uprooted by gin, chaos blossomed like an unattended garden. Children dashed through the streets, half-clad and unsupervised, while mothers desperately clung to their sanity, sipping their own concoctions and hoping for the best. Imagine treating life like a game of hopscotch, but instead of chalk you're using bottles and splashes of gin while pretending you know how to balance it all. Parents began leaning on their newfound best friend, gin, to cope, leading to a dizzying cycle of highs and lows, from laughter to delirium, all grounded by the common notion that this relationship with Monster Juice would lead to enlightenment, or at the very least, an embarrassing few minutes of revelry. However, herein lies the crux. It wasn't long before Londoners began swirling in circles of despair. The elation that once lifted them now loomed like a dreadful cloud, draped lazily across the rooftops, like the neighbour you never wanted but who lives just a tad too close. The repercussions of this dusty romance soon settled into the crevices of society, and families scraped against the underbelly of economic desperation. Households strained as money intended for bread ended up in the cosy pockets of local distillers, who surely giggled at their ever-expanding empire, complete with a throne made of empty gin bottles and a crown of discarded tonic cans. By the time the gin craze truly took hold, with its grasp looming larger than that of your best friend who can't take a hint, it was clear London was on the brink of pandemonium, and no one seemed willing to climb down from their lovingly crafted gins of ardent desire. Alas, in this merry meal of liquid courage, the city learned the hard way that the thrill of the drink can offer temporary euphoria, but bottoms up often led to bottoms falling out, both literally and figuratively. With each clink of the glass, families ventured deeper into the bottomless pit of ridiculousness, where laughter mingled with violent confrontations, heartwarming stories morphed into tragic dilemmas, and children roamed the streets unsupervised, each in search of the next thrill. So, as we gaze back at the dizzying dance of gin in London, it's hard not to chuckle at the warm absurdity of it all. A societal mishap orchestrated by spirits meant to lighten the heart, but, alas, starkly departed from reason, logic, and, basic human decency. Who would have thought that something so innocuous would ignite a spark that would engulf society? Let's raise a metaphorical glass to the fog of gin that hung over London, and toast to clean living that followed. Because after all, what happens in gin stays in gin may have been the rallying cry of an entire generation. Cheers. Imagine walking down a cobblestone street in London, and instead of the sound of horse-drawn carriages, you hear the sound of joyous shouts, and the occasional crash from someone taking their first delightful, wobbly sip of gin. When was the last time you had a drink so good it made all of your regrets feel like minor inconveniences? In Georgian London, gin was not just a drink. It was a gateway to new friendships, or embarrassing public performances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the taverns flickered to life like moths drawn into flames, beckoning weary souls to come and forget their woes for a while. Step into your favourite pub, though, and you'll quickly find that gin has no limits. The robust aroma of juniper wafts through the air, mingling with the warm scents of muddled fruit and cheap tobacco. And let's not forget the symphony of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the unfortunate sounds of someone trying to recite a poem while half in the bag. Have you ever tried to eloquently express your love for gin? It's like trying to unravel spaghetti with chopsticks, difficult and often messy. The gin-fueled bard, however, would probably take another swig and claim their genius was simply too profound for sober ears. But gin's role wasn't just about drowning sorrows or showing off lyrical prowess. It offered something deeper. In an age where social status was measured by the amount of gin one could consume without succumbing to a tragic fate, this deceptively potent beverage transformed humble gatherings into literary salons where Shakespearean soliloquies fought for airtime against tales of the latest neighbourhood mischief. Conversations flowed as smoothly as the gin itself, binding strangers in a camaraderie built on shared sips amid a backdrop of hopeful dreams. Now, imagine the poor souls braving the streets, fueled by liquid courage. It was like watching a live-action episode of a reality show where everyone is vying for the spotlight, but also inadvertently auditioning for disaster relief. You couldn't help but wonder, was it the gin prompting them to belt out their best rendition of Hey Jude? Or was it simply the music of the night? The boundaries between weighty discussions on the current state of politics and impromptu dance-offs faded faster than a sober mind amidst an open bar. It wasn't unusual to find oneself in mid-debate about the merits of a well-distilled spirit when in charge of supporting a profoundly absurd idea. The neighbourhood criminals throwing gin-fueled gatherings. Even minors were swept up in the gin craze, with children sometimes found hovering outside the pubs, eyes peeled for a coin to get in on the action. Rumour has it some brave little souls donned the disguise of adult-sized hats and coats, all in efforts to sprint toward the welcoming embrace of gin's delightful wonder. It's a marvel to think that only a century prior, children were having tea parties rather than riotous rums. Who needs toys when you've got tales of grand adventures fueled by a pint-sized dram? It's practically a rite of passage for the youth of Georgian London, but as they say, every rose has its thorn, or maybe in this case, every beloved, too-good-to-be-true drink has its price. For as the elation from that first sip of gin had families laughing together, gin also had a knack for turning familial relationships on their heads. Picture the scene. You take your lively uncle to the pub for a celebratory pint, only to find yourself later handing him a glass of water at 3 a.m, while he insists the cat is, in fact, a secret agent planted by the neighbour. Suddenly, family love morphs into negotiations about whether you love Uncle Larry more than Martini Mondays. But with all the joy gin brought to sociable lives, there was an equally unintentional side effect. Parenthood often became a game of hide-and-seek. "Where's Daddy?" became far easier to answer once the gin o'clock rolled around than listing his many beloved 3 p.m. haunts. Gin was the toast of the town, but also bit the hands that fed it. While it united in laughter, it fractured homes behind closed doors. Yet, in the midst of the collapsing social fabric, the thirst for gin wasn't quelled. Perhaps, then, it's no wonder it shaped the feelings of an evolving society. And as you navigate this dizzying whirlpool of joy, heartbreak, and liquid camaraderie, maybe a sliver of humility rests there, reminding us all that every great love affair with gin begins with that first sip, like stepping into an unexpected and somewhat chaotic affair you'll never forget. And as the night continues, while the tavern doors swing open, welcome to the celebration that gin offers, where all can indulge, laugh, cry, and forget their woes. Just remember to stay upright, or else you'll become one of those stories people tell as a cautionary tale. Cheers. Here's a fun fact. In the 1700s, the only thing worse than an unlicensed pub was the terrible gin served in it. The recipes for gin were as varied as the patrons drinking them, often resulting in concoctions so vile you'd rather lick cobwebs. How did this seemingly harmless beverage turn families into wandering souls more interested in gin than groceries? Spoiler alert, the answer is often hiding at the bottom of the bottle. You see, gin wasn't just a drink, it was the soul of social interactions, the glue that held together community meetings at the local tavern, like duct tape, only stickier and more likely to get you kicked out of your own house. Imagine it. A family man, weary from a day's labour, walks into one of those makeshift gin shops. After all, who could resist a gathering of desperate souls wrapped around barrels of dubious liquor? The air is thick with the scent of fermented grains and regret. It's practically a spa day for poor life choices. He tells himself, just one little drink to take the edge off. but by 1 he means 10, and his dreams of adding vegetables to the family supper have vanished like his sobriety. How did we get here? Welcome to the unintended consequences of gin distillation, my friend. The genesis of this every man for himself gin culture was tied to the rapid urbanisation of London. When people flocked to the city for work during the Industrial Revolution, they didn't just bring their tools, they brought their thirst. Enter the gin distilleries, minimal regulations and maximum profit. Distilling gin became as easy as baking a pie if that pie involved mischief, a bit of grain, and enough alcohol to temporarily forget your name and the responsibilities that came with it. Take a moment and picture the average gin shop, dimly lit with flickering candles, its walls lined with questionable portraits of past patrons who might have had better days during their sober hours. Inside, emotion runs high as patrons stumble about, swearing allegiances to one another over mugs of toxic liquid, promising to support each other through thick and thin, until one gets stepped on by a neighbour, then proclaims loudly, "Heavens, there's a rat." It's hard to find a family that wasn't touched by the shenanigans inspired by gin. The village drunk may have gone home, but not without dragging 4 or 5 good souls with him on the way. Now, if you wanted to bond with your spouse, your best bet was to discuss how many spoons of gin would give the children a good night's sleep. Or perhaps it was for you to forget the children entirely. The line between twisted humour and genuine concern blurred beautifully in gin-infused conversations. "Why have a family dinner when we can have gin nuggets?" became a popular catchphrase. Yes, you heard it correctly, gin nuggets. Dinner's wild cousin that no one invited but always showed up nonetheless. Even children weren't immune to the allure of gin, when they weren't dodging parental digressions about how to behave properly. They were left wide-eyed as their relatives tried convincing themselves that a little gin wouldn't hurt. Families made pitiful attempts to keep their children safe, claiming gin tasted like sugary nectar. Never mind that the sweetness was likely from the hint of syrup mixed in with regrettable ingredients of dubious origin. As gin rolled into family meetings and gatherings, the sense of dignity faded like the last golden rays of sunset before a London rainstorm. Picture Great Aunt Martha, who hadn't moved in 5 years, suddenly leaping up to perform a jolly jig, carte blanche given only by a tipple too far. The entire family would be shaking their heads in disbelief while struggling to catch their breath from laughter, and perhaps witnessing the greater antics of gin-winning referee duties in everyday life. This silly chaos weaves beautifully into a tale about how gin took hospitality and turned it into something akin to a circus without an animal tamer in sight. Suddenly, families prepared for get-togethers that would guarantee endless laughter, questionable advice, and a disjointed recollection of what actually took place the following week. The kind where siblings would argue for years over who spilled the dimple punch bowl and who suggested eggnog, leaving scars deeper than gin could ever salve. So, what's the moral of the story, you ask? Well, it's hardly a lesson in moderation. The chaos instigated by gin reflected the ultimate recipe for social disaster. As families stumbled through their responsibilities and clear paths blurred into muddy drinking games, they unwittingly summoned the spirit, not of resilience, but of revelry. As it turned out, their true bonds lay not just in their shared laughter or love for gin, but also in how they coped, emerged, and waltzed around life's many misfortunes, always with a little spirit in hand. If you thought family reunions were awkward now, picture what they must have been like back when Dad strolled into the living room, 2 sheets to the wind, saluting the cat as though it were a royal dignitary. Gin had an unfortunate talent for drawing out the worst in people, and family bonds became as tangled as the threads of their worn clothing. What happens when your loved ones dedicate their affection to spirits instead? These were no ordinary dinners. They were wild games of charades mixed with tragicomic performances. You might witness Grandma arguing with Uncle Bob about whose turn it was to pour the next round, only to discover they were arguing about which one of them was less sober. Newsflash, it was neither. Let's not forget the dinner table itself. With cocktails in hand, those delightful wooden surfaces morphed from steadfast dining platforms to chaotic stages for family meltdowns. Imagine sinking knee-deep into mashed potatoes while Dad rambles on about the virtues of gin, oblivious to the world. You know, he'd slur, waving his fork like a wand. Back in my day, we didn't need fancy drinks, just high-proof gin and a strong sense of denial. Would you rather battle the Christmas pudding or dodge an entire food pyramid of gin-fueled opinions? Spoiler alert, very few chose wisely. And just when you thought the family drama couldn't get any more absurd, let's talk about the youngsters. Kids who would otherwise be playing outside began honing their watching Uncle George wrestle with reality skills instead. Picture this scenario. A group of children peeking from the kitchen doorway as Uncle George attempts to teach them to sway gracefully, like drunken swans, while waving a half-empty gin bottle like a baton. Kids observing the art of misguided adulting. They absorbed all the charm and chaos while forming their own opinions about alcohol, opinions that would soon become dangerous ground for family conversations. But the gin didn't just serve as a muse for drunken antics, it also laid bare the previously concealed fractures in family dynamics. The illusion of hapless laughter quickly faded into arguments that could make Shakespeare cringe with envy. Uncle George, embroiled in some fantastical tale about the fabled gin gods, would invariably ignite tensions. A simple, "Not everyone believes in gin gods," Uncle George, could trigger explosive debates, punctuated by door slams and the occasional shattered glass. Honestly, it's just fermented grain, not a holy relic. You can't make this up. As the gin craze continued its delightful rampage, entire family fortunes seemed to dissolve like sugar in water. Reckless spending became the norm, with household budgets tossed aside faster than a half-consumed bottle of the good stuff. Mortgages, bills, and even shoes for the children slid down the priority list while gin-filled evenings marched on, championed by Dad's newfound mantra of a sip for every woe. Families soon discovered that nothing bonded them quite like facing eviction together because of Daddy's gin-induced financial mischief. Cheers to family togetherness, they'd toast as they packed their bags, laughter echoing down the now gin-soaked hallway. And for the women of the household, their roles turned from innocent observers to fierce warriors, battling the consequences of gin-saturated decisions. In a haze of resentment and neglect, wives learned to fight for what little remained of their dignity amid constant shindigs and uninhibited revelry. Picture a motley crew of determined wives rallying together armed with broomsticks, ready to confront their husbands and reclaim their homes. Not so fast, lads. You'll need more than gin-laden charm to handle us. And somehow, amidst the chaos, the cries of "you'll regret this in the morning" morphed into an odd battle cry. But amidst this whirlwind of chaos, there were glimmers of clarity. Families rediscovered awkward affection through the haze of drunkenness, slogging through patchy conversations that resembled a battlefield more than a love fest. They learned to appreciate small victories, the random thank you notes found scribbled on napkins, the moments when someone actually remembered to return a borrowed coat, or the time someone decided to stick together. Gin cravings be damned. In the end, the gin craze didn't just redefine social gatherings, it stirred the pot of family life, blending absurdity with resilience, chaos with laughter, and teaching each household that sometimes, just sometimes, affection can be found at the bottom of a glass. even when family bonds felt like they'd unravel at any moment. Whatever happened to family dinners after the gin craze cooled down? You'd better believe they remained just as spirited, albeit with a bit more sober consideration, and perhaps only half as much gin. While you might think of children as innocent, in Georgian London they had a unique role as the lost generation, succumbing to the same gin-soaked escapades as their parents, but with none of the social skills to cope. How did a simple beverage redefine childhood? Welcome to the world of baby boots instead of bibs, where every sip from mum's cup was an adventure. Children wandered the streets, perpetually ducking under the spectral haze of gin fumes, looking for fun wherever they could find it, often creating their own mischief. If you ever wondered how children managed to get tangled in wild tales of homemade adventures, blame a little liquid courage mixed with their parents' lax supervision. Picture this: toddlers, overly cheerful with wide-eyed innocence, growing up in households where gin was the main course. Evening family dinners were less about roast beef and potatoes, and more like slapping a bottle of gin in the middle of the table and calling it good. As pints were poured, children were unwittingly trained in the fine arts of mixing, which, let's be honest, should never cross the child-rearing curriculum. In the land of drunken toasts, kids learned early on which tables to climb under to preserve their honour or keep the gin from spilling. With parents busy revelling in their own revelries, it became quite the norm for children to roam unaccompanied, offering them an all-access pass to London's rawest adventures. Imagine dodging carts while trying to catch pigeons, learning how to balance a gin glass like a circus act, or avoiding the judgment of sober adults. The streets were a playground for the brave and foolish alike, where children were often found engaging in activities that would make a Victorian parent faint dead away. The unfortunate side effect: this new breed of youth thrived in chaos, often creating friendships more akin to puff pastry, flaky, delicate, and utterly nonsensical. But it wasn't all fun and games in Gin Lane. These children quickly learned to navigate between disastrous debris and uncertain footing thanks to their parents' propensity to accidentally create makeshift obstacle courses while intoxicated. Athletes of adversity, they were also stressful champions, sprouting gallant claims that they were mere innocent bystanders when questioned by stone-faced police officers about any noteworthy antics. Parents, however, were oblivious. If the kids weren't dipping into the precious gin barrel, they were regularly raiding the larder, filling their bellies with whatever was left over from dinner, or, heaven forbid, fewer bottles of gin instead of milk. Let's talk gatherings. Family reunions transformed into boisterous assemblies of chaotic genius, where toddlers learned to engage with their relatives in a new lingo. Honesty, but only if it was funny. Who stole Uncle Bertie's last drink soon became the leading conversation starter, essentially a light-hearted family feud in the making. The child grabbed it first became a fair party response, often accompanied by tinkling laughs, but devoid of parenting consideration. So, children skillfully navigated the balance of winning mental points by throwing blame, thus bonding with their parents through the most absurd of circumstances. Of course, this social experiment wasn't without consequence. A heavy gin intake among parents often resulted in strange spikes of creativity in their kids. It led to altogether strange experiences. A toddler declaring their destiny to become a champion of all the pigeons, or competing in imaginative races that terrified passing horses. The messes left behind would make any Victorian parent weep bitterly, but alas, suffering was a tradition. The funny thing is that, while the legacy of gin undeniably embedded itself into the fabric of childhood in Georgian London, the laughter mixed with tears rarely stopped flowing. As the society around them became increasingly entangled in their admiration for gin, children started tossing their youthful misunderstandings around. Incredibly empowered, they would proudly declare, "I'm not drinking gin, I'm just keeping watch." Articulately confusing? Absolutely. Somehow they found a way to gloriously celebrate their predicament with an air of duty. Yet, one can't help but wonder about the future of a generation raised by gin. How would they navigate adulthood, their innate compass calibrated by the night's revelry? Much like the tumbleweeds that rolled down the streets of Georgian London, they would undoubtedly end up wherever the wind took them, acquainted with adventure and well practiced for the inevitable consequences of whatever 8-pint gleanings await. So, imagine that the next time you hear a child's laugh down a London alley, remember, each giggle may actually be a tribute to gin, filled with both chaos and charm from the children of the Gin Crusade. They may just be more resilient than we give them credit for, thriving in an era beautifully steeped in absurdity and innocence against the backdrop of a swirling, glittering metropolis. Welcome to one of the most heated debates ever, the one that occurs when a family gathers around a table. The spirit in question is double gin, and the opinions are as ignited as the fumes rising from the glass. What's a light-hearted conversation about how many times Uncle Bertie has told the same story, without gin drinking at its heart? Spoiler, everyone has an opinion and zero memories. The stage is set. A slightly rickety table fills with relatives strategically casting confused glances at the emptying gin bottles, as if they contain the answers to the universe itself. As gin begins to flow like awkward apologies at a family reunion, the chatter starts innocently enough. Aunt Mabel begins with her famous, "Did I tell you about when I got locked in the chicken coop for 3 hours? The chickens were so insulted they tried to peck me to the next realm." Cue the laughter as Uncle Tim pipes up, "Oh, that's nothing. Remember when you thought your gin was water and watered the roses with it?" And just like that, the cocktails take their effect, transforming harmless ribbing into the perfect storm of familial disputes. The gin-coated atmosphere thickens, as if one could cut the tension with a spoon conveniently used to stir the family secrets nobody really wants to hear. Speaking of secrets, ever hear the one about Cousin Lucy's questionable choices at last year's Christmas party? I don't see what the fuss is about. I mean, everyone has that one moment in life when they accidentally serenade the dog with a gin-soaked rendition of "God Save the Queen," she might say defiantly, only for Aunt Mabel to retort with a stylish flick of her wrist. And some people, like you, one gin too many, end up thinking they can sing. Families, fueled on gin, transform from mild-mannered citizens to royal warriors in a gladiatorial arena, equipped with nothing but opinions and the newest round of cocktails. Voices rise and fall like the sun and the moon, each relative attempting to prove their gin-infused wisdom is superior. The drama unfurls gradually, tipsy twists of it all playing out like a Shakespearean comedy. "Why did you marry that bloke again?" Uncle Tim would challenge Lucy sitting across the table, and just like that, the evening's debate shifts gears from fun anecdotes to discussing the embarrassing details of everyone's romantic life that should have been forgotten under a massive mountain of gin-induced haze. But who amongst them would dare to be the voice of reason, the sober-minded one, when everyone else is clinking glasses? Let's not talk about our choices tonight. Let's talk about the gin, Cousin Jack tries to interject. Gin is a drink for everyone. You don't need a degree in philosophy to appreciate it. Of course, it certainly wasn't a doctoral thesis that led to him announcing just last week he was leaving his job for a career as a gin artist, whatever that meant. Let's not pretend either that everyone isn't already somewhat convinced by Jack's enthusiasm, or rather, completely intoxicated by it. And speaking of gins, Last Tuesday, I picked up the limited edition Elderflower Elation. You won't believe how it tumbled through the waves of my palate. The nods and clinking of glasses drown out the rest of Jack's monologue, for it is clear that in this family, the wellspring of gin-fueled fascination is irresistible. But as the phrase goes, variety is the spice of life. Suddenly, Aunt Mabel is drawn into the debate about gin flavours, her eyes lighting up with excitement, keen to argue why her homemade poached pear gin was better than anything you can find in the cut-rate pubs. And before you know it, everyone is taking sides like they just stumbled into a football match. You'd think it was a matter of life and death. No one can quite recall how the conversation bounced from gin types to the latest atrocity of whether it's right to drink gin and tonic out of industrial-sized mugs, but here we are. The ferocity of human connection in stateside inebriation knows no bounds, nor does it follow common rules of decorum. But as we observe this family spectacle, is this the reckless throes of gin-induced battles, or do they know something we don't? Perhaps these jarring arguments about gin add a sloshy, rosy hue to the otherwise mundane existence back home. They are the bittersweet glue holding a family together, swirling around the dinner table with laughter and weariness. Every heated opinion is a tangled thread in the fabric of familial history, each round of drinks weaving its unstitchable legacy. In the glorious chaos of gin, love binds as fiercely as the drink itself, even when it leads to shouting matches and merrily tipped chairs. Indeed, somewhere amid the hilarity of escaping from the emotional boundaries, only to grapple with siblings' personal choices, originates genuine affection. Because at the end of the night, those gin-induced debates reveal the complexities that make every family beautifully dysfunctional, like gin. It's always a wild ride. If you thought your budget was tight, let's discuss how families found themselves in dire straits thanks to their beloved gin. One day you're having a reasonable dinner, and the next you're selling the family cow to fund Dad's gin collection. How did financial juggernaut become synonymous with a single drink? Happy hour has never had so much responsibility. Picture the scene. You're gathered around a modest table with your loved ones, the aroma of stew mingling with the last dregs of a warm ale. It seems innocent enough, right? But then disaster strikes. Dad slips out the back door for fresh air and returns smelling like a convivial distillery explosion. Within days, that same dinner table transforms into a scene more reminiscent of a soap opera than a harmonious family meal. One moment, you're discussing the price of wool, and the next, you're gauging how many shillings you can sell your favourite goat for to keep the gin jug full. And then there's Mom, who went from the charming matron of the house to a concerned accountant, tallying the expenses of poppingly cheerful gin-fueled nights. Ever tried explaining to your children why today's breakfast is just stale bread and last week's cheese? Not an easy task. If only there were a class on handling family finances while evading an imbalance involving significant drinking. Children, she'd croon over the sink, you can have fresh milk. Or, well, you can also enjoy the sweet, silky taste of gin. Spoiler alert, sweet doesn't exactly encapsulate the earthy notes of an under-the-counter cheap gin swill. But invoking a gin-fueled financial meltdown isn't just for dramatic storytelling. It's a reality that tore apart families in a chorus of teary-eyed negotiations over how to navigate life without livestock or sufficient food. Imagine the children watching as their parents, once strong pillars of guidance, list their prized possessions as if they were struggling contestants on a reality show called Who Can Sell the Most Items for Gin? The little voices could only holler, "But what about the cow, Mommy?" The assumption was that they could live off gin flavouring alone, blissfully ignoring the nutritional gap it left behind. Draw a line in the sand, and you'll find that families were not just softening the edges of their budgets, they were rejuvenating sketchy finances with a vigour previously unknown. As gin prices dropped, consumption skyrocketed. Suddenly, local taverns were more crowded than a midnight rave. The tavern became the modern-day family living room, a cosy, loud space where laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses and the heart-wrenching sobs of someone carrying their last few coins. It was pub therapy, where the treatment was more gin and sadness than good advice. On any given evening, if you pricked your ears, you'd find voices echoing through the alleyways, revealing the dark truth. Neighbours telling others how they fared when they attempted to have a quiet night at home, only to be swayed by the alluring promise of a nearby pub. A drink might taste like minty fresh honey, but it also just might cost you your chances of household peace, puppies, and your mother's French onion dip recipe that everyone loved. Thus began a grand cycle, where families found themselves awash in a river of costs and consequences. The near-perpetual question was, are we drinking tonight, or are we buying bread for the kids? This tortured equation was no longer a one-off occurrence. It became an intimate dance of economics, love, and alcohol flowing into coping mechanisms, especially for those who felt crushed under the burden of daily life. And there were unexpected consequences too. Remember that family cow? Well, once Uncle Bertie sold it to keep the gin flowing, everyone had to get creative with their mealtime fare. "Tonight's dish will be a surprise stew, children," was a tricky ruse that cleverly avoided the question, "Hey, where'd Bessie go?" Eventually, the beleaguered wallets found a sliver of hope as families learned to navigate the treacherous waters of gin economics. Creativity became their currency, culminating in dynamic discussion groups over the dinner table regarding how to best spend on household sustenance. This newfound financial acumen led them to blend practicality with revelry, creating a dynamic sweet spot for community bonding, one that would charm even the most disdainful pub-goer. Though the gin craze brought chaos, it undoubtedly redefined the concept of family resilience. Ultimately, the tales of travail transformed into folklore that demonstrated how laughter and absurdity managed to outlast sobering moments, reminding us that even in tumultuous times, families could find warmth amidst the madness, regardless of how much of their earnings was sacrificed on the altar of gin. In the end, gauging life's balance became both an art and a necessity, one where the love for gin would forever be tangled in the fibres of family connections, debts, and a surprisingly brave sense of humour. Ever wondered what your local gin shop's ambience would really feel like? Forget boozy Instagram shots. Imagine a dive bar decked out by slightly deranged artisans, where the only goal is to keep the good times flowing, no matter the consequences. It's a victory for social experience, and a defeat for rational thought. Now, picture walking into one of these establishments during the gin craze in Georgian London. The air thick with the scent of juniper berries and regret, and the walls adorned with murals depicting saints clearly overwhelmed by the hangover of their own mirth. Welcome to a venue where the primary currency is laughter, and the secondary currency is somebody's dignity, which conveniently runs a tab that's always mysteriously lost. The moment you step inside, you're greeted by a chorus of raucous laughter, questions about where your mother would like to go for dinner, and an errant chicken seeking solace among the dirty tablecloths. There's no turning back now. Each table is a veritable shrine dedicated to overindulgence, with patrons either celebrating life's smallest victories or commiserating over life's profound tragedies, typically fueled by the same golden liquid. And all this occurs while someone attempts to convince the barmaid to serve their drink in a fancy teacup for elegance. Because who doesn't want to sip a lethal cocktail from dainty china, right? It gets better. As the hour gets later, the gin shop transforms into a veritable circus. Over in the corner, an equally inebriated poet attempts to compose the next great English sonnet, but alas, all he can muster is a somewhat proud ode to his own moustache. Meanwhile, the local philosopher pontificates on the merits of gin as a metaphor for life, something about how both can be intoxicating, but one will leave you faceless in a back alley. You might wonder, isn't that an existential thought? But you quickly remember you came here to escape the crushing reality instead of contemplating something whimsical like your own mortality. Now let's not forget our favourite character, the gregarious gin wizard, who struts around in a tattered waistcoat that once belonged to a very confused gentleman indeed. He fancies himself the connoisseur of all things gin, even though he's more like your raucous uncle who once won a thumb war against a squirrel. He'll evangelise about every available gin, from the smoothest sips to the ones that could peel paint off the walls. If you're unfortunate enough to request a cocktail, brace yourself. You're about to be inundated with unsolicited recipes that sound more like conjuring spells than mixing drinks. However, let's face it, dear listener, once you've partaken, you discover that there's a rite of passage involved in ordering a drink here. A competition to see who can keep a straight face while tripping over the phrase gin fizz, after being subjected to the bartender's insistence that it's a vibrant, euphoric experience. You're handed your concoction adorned by an entire citrus farm, and suddenly you question every decision that led to this moment. And what about the customers? They're not just bodies spilling into the chairs. They're characters brought to life from a Dickensian novel, with tales of lost love, broken dreams, and a bizarre attachment to fully grown tomatoes that currently reside in the pocket of a bewildered fellow sprawled across the floor. You start to realise that this gin shop, more than any cultural institution, holds a mirror to the self-inflicted misadventures of humanity. The resilience of the human spirit is no match for the spirit in that glass. Drunk on laughter and overpriced gin, the patrons connect through absurdities, an intoxicated pact to relive these chaotic moments once the sun rises. As you listen to their tales, you can't help but share a smile with a stranger over the latest gin-fueled escapade, as if that unfortunate decision to drink something called the bewitched banshee doesn't matter at all. You perform your own little sleight of hand as you balance precariously on your stool, feeling the rhythm of the night in your veins, until the bartender announces last call and the gravity of reality crashes in like a ton of unlicensed potatoes. So, as the light begins to fade and the laughter turns into sobbing regrets or raucous cheers, sometimes both, you'll understand that these gin shops are indeed modern-day temples of alcoholism, where every sip tells a story, and every stagger toward the door is just another epic chapter in the grand drama of life. Cheers to that. Picture this. Sailors swapped sea stories for gin, and somehow every version got taller, wilder, and about 4 times less true. Because who needs facts when gin is present? What were these tales of daring and disaster fueled by, if not the sticky sweet sensation of forgetting the previous night's events? Imagine a local tavern, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of worn-out promises, and the air thick with laughter, drama, and the bittersweet scent of spilled gin. It's the perfect backdrop for a host of stories as colourful as the gin punch they consume. Tales that blend reality and fantasy like a half-hearted attempt at artisanal cocktail mixing. Take, for instance, the esteemed Captain Reginald Rumfog Thompson. Legend has it that he once saved a crew from a band of roving pirates by out-drinking them in a contest that supposedly spiralled into an interpretive dance-off. The fine details are muddled, of course. Perhaps the sailors were actually out fishing, and the pirates were just the local constabulary trying to uphold the law. But try telling that to the ensorcelled audience at the Black Spot Tavern. Fueled by gin and the eagerness to impress, captains in the making take their turns fabricating similar tales, each one larger than the last. How else do you end up with the story of Old Man Jenkins, who allegedly wrestled a bear after a pint too many? Perhaps he was trying to pet a rather lazy, disinterested tabby cat. The result was surely less thrilling, yet when told over round after round of gin, who could intervene? It's all in good fun, people would say, chuckling through hiccups and gasps of laughter, while poor Jen's tale takes a turn into mythological territory, where bears offered hugs instead of raspberries to unsuspecting sailors. This spiralling into absurdity wasn't limited to the sailors. Families too found themselves caught in this potent current, where gin became more than just a drink. It was a lifeline. Consider the tale of Mary and George, a couple who loved their gin as much as they loved avoiding responsibility. One particularly gin-soaked evening, they decided to host a tasting party, which quickly devolved into a contest of who can sing the loudest and forget their troubles fastest. Neighbours gathered, swaying and slurring, further convinced that every note they belted could drown out the woes of raising children, serving bosses, and navigating the treacherous social waters of Georgian London. Mary would regale her fellow revellers about the time she attempted to assert dominance over her neighbour's smug cat with a gin-fuelled battle cry. "Fetch me the feathers of that wretched beast," she'd declare, only to have the cat ambivalent, blinking at her like she interrupted a very important nap. The crowd would erupt in laughter, each punchline cushioned by their collective indulgence, allowing Mary second-hand bravery through gin. But, darling listeners, don't mistake this for mere chaos. Within the floating haze of high spirits, redemption often lurked just beneath the surface. It was not uncommon, amidst all the drivel and drunken revelry, for a sailor to stumble upon a heartfelt confession over a shared pint. Spirited conversations would often lead to glorious tales of past glory and foolishness alike, leading to grand moments of reflection that could reshape lives. Sure, George might have forgotten his wife's name the morning after, but last night, wrapped in each other's gin breath, they promised to reconcile the woes of yesterday. Stories of longing and regret nestled themselves alongside laughter, reflecting the complex tapestry of Georgian life, where the line between revelry and tragedy blurred with every drop. Sailors remembered their stranded kin back home. Families recalled those they lost to the very drink that made them laugh, and together they forged connections over shared experiences, however embellished. As the taverns echoed with half-true stories, those simple narratives began to shape the collective consciousness of the community, living proof that even amidst the unfurling insanity of gin, moments of clarity were hard-fought and well-earned. Martyr or fool, every speaker added to the legend, as each interaction became more than just a transaction of spirits. It evolved into a release, a renaissance of sort, where they could cast aside judgment for the night and embrace the messy, beautiful reality of being just a little too human. So there you have it. The intoxication of gin provided a playground for souls to navigate their dreams and disasters, transforming lives through the alchemy of shared stories. A toast to the eternal dance of folly and redemption, spun into existence with just the right amount of gin. Have you ever considered visiting a doctor just to hear them recommend gin? Neither did anyone in Georgian London. Welcome to a time when ailments were treated with more gin and less reason. You'd be shocked to find out how many diseases disappeared in fog directly correlated with the influx of stronger distillation methods. You might think that drinking spirit after spirit would have sent patients running out of the doctor's offices with transformed maladies, but you'd be wrong. In this peculiar era, a good belt of gin was seen as a cure-all for just about anything. That headache? A splash of gin. An upset stomach? A shot of gin. The plague? Well, let's not get too carried away, but gin made everything feel slightly less imminent. Picture this: a doctor in his smock, a white cap perched precariously atop his head, leaning forward conspiratorially as he whispers his prescription to a feverish patient. Take 2 shots of this fine gin, and you'll feel right as rain. The idea that a potent alcoholic solution could heal you had taken a firm grasp on society. And why would one question such logic where traditionally a hangover was simply referred to as a touch of the spirits? Doctors were not always bastions of rationality after all. Got a cough? Well, what's more comforting than a warm gin toddy? The sweet aroma of sugar, the comforting warmth of alcohol, and the added bonus of making your relatives think you were on the brink of profound wisdom as you slurred your way through an incoherent rant about the king's latest folly. It's like your very own miracle elixir, only without the mythical claims. In fact, many people believed gin was medicinal, sometimes even sipping it straight from the bottle, with the ease and confidence of an Olympic athlete heading for the gold. As you traverse the market streets of London, you notice looks of concern followed by head-shaking disapproval towards those who dared resist the gin tide. Oh, you're feeling sick. Have you tried gin? Nobody bothered with practical remedies like rest, fresh air, or herbal potions. Obviously, the real answer was cooking a gin concoction with neither flavour nor care. What about those bedridden and demanding something sweet and therapeutic? Enter notorious gin lounges in every corner, filled with the sweet, sticky scent of everything from mediocre spirits to the newest botanical blends that promised miraculous effects. Bathing in gin was practically a service. Who needs soap when so many jovial bartenders were eager for a contribution to history's largest public experiment on drunkenness? Just stir in a sprinkle of health, and you've got yourself a cocktail for success. Now let's not overlook the scandals. Doctors quickly caught on to the fact that gin-fueled visits to their offices came with a set of monetary benefits. In order to keep business healthy, many practitioners delightedly wrapped patients around their fingers. "I'll treat you," went the unspoken agreement, "if you promise to stock up on my recommended gin supply." With each sip a slippery slope from well-being to, "Whoa there, I'm seeing link arms with a chicken. How'd that happen?" Families were drawn into an elaborate web of gin-induced hysteria, with paternal figures raising their glasses in shouts of celebration for every ailment conquered and every ounce of sobriety obliterated. As gin's reign surged through London, it also accompanied a rise in apartment watchguards alongside a decrease in bank stocks, all due to questionable life choices. How often did men stumble home, cradling their last pint of gin, triumphantly celebrating their taste for fine spirits, while their loved ones grimaced in empathetic dismay? The answer is, far too often. Even with this twisted sense of medicinal comfort, the health of the nation began to dwindle. Experts, real experts mind you, not the gin-drinking kind, sent warnings about the consequences of the gin craze. People were becoming bound to their bottles. Finances slipped through fingers like so much spilled alcohol on a bar floor. And those dreams of health slowly turned into slurred imaginings of gin-fueled glory. So here you are, standing in the heart of Georgian London, wrestling with the irony that gin was both the remedy and the affliction. Families gathered around fading candlelight, reminiscing about better days between swigs of loud, clinking glasses, while children ran around with nothing but their laughter and a dream of feeling better. Gin had truly become a bonding experience, twisting sips into bonds stronger than any family had ever known. You can't make this stuff up. In a world where gin could heal the sick and create a universal community through confusion and merriment, who are you to judge? So, the next time you pour yourself a glass of something delightful at night, remember the couples in Georgian London sharing a bittersweet bond over the joys of their beloved gin, even as they stumble through the uncertainties of their own substance-fueled reality. Remember, every generation has its catalyst, and for them it was gin that crafted a history worth toasting to. Picture the scene. Women trying to attend social events while dodging men offering them gin like unsolicited advice at Thanksgiving dinner. Ladies found themselves at the forefront, balancing expectations, desires, and far too many gin-laden encounters. How did this spirit challenge social norms and leave women fighting for their independence, much like trying to reclaim the last piece of cake? In a time when being a respectable woman meant avoiding scandal, introducing gin into the mix was like tossing a lit firecracker into a room full of straw. Suddenly, the pressures to maintain decorum were overshadowed by laughter and stumbling and flirting on the scales of social acceptability. As gin shops popped up on every corner, these establishments morphed into makeshift community centres where, for a few pennies, ladies could whittle away the hours gossiping, laughing, and yes, drinking more gin than a mariner on shore leave. You could find ladies as young as 16, their honour hanging in the balance with every sip. Can you picture a teenager in a flowing gown, desperate to look sophisticated, while desperately trying to sip without spilling her gin-laden punch? One moment could determine whether she was seen as the belle of the ball or the family shame. Definitely not the highlight of the season. But it wasn't just about personal choice. It was also a silent revolution. As they clinked their cups in rebellion, women began to explore a new idea of freedom, one that did not involve genteel tea parties and needlework, but rather spirited discussions filled with gin and ambition. While sipping their libations, they envisioned futures beyond their well-ordered lives, which seems both tantalizing and terrifying. The more they drank, the more they dared to dream. And let's be honest, the view through a gin haze can be breathtakingly bold. However, the gin-drinking escapade was riddled with consequences. The moralists of the era scented disaster like bloodhounds, and they were absolutely convinced that gin was the devil's elixir. They painted visions of women turning into wild creatures, cackling like witches as they staggered from pub to street corner, somehow managing to trip over their own shadows. With each headline proclaiming a moral crisis, the ladies of London became subjects of increasingly absurd tales. Rumours of a genie-laden revolt against chaperones caused many an eyebrow to raise and clutches of pearls to be tightly held. Such scrutiny, of course, made no difference to the determined women who went on to claim their space in the gin-drenched taverns of the city. Armed with their own wit and an unshakable will, they campaigned as fiercely as they drank, banding together like a crew of intrepid sea travellers navigating through uncharted waters. "Why shouldn't we have a drink of gin?" they'd ask, cheers echoing louder than any man's protest. It wasn't just a drink, it was a statement, a challenge to the rules, dictating who they could be and how they could live. Picture Mrs. Panton, the poster lady for gin-drinking independence, who defiantly danced in the streets, nearly spilling her cup of gin as she cheerfully warbled the latest tune. The men around her were taken aback, unsure of whether to cheer her on or attempt to escort her home like concerned fathers. Imagining her there, a wild spirit born from the very chaos of the gin craze, gives us a glimpse into the pulsating heart of societal change. And then, just when everything seemed to spiral hilariously out of control, the gin craze began to ebb. There was a kind of reckoning. The ladies who had so boldly danced their way to newfound freedoms were suddenly faced with the stark reality of public opinion. As sobriety ushered in a return to normalcy, it aimed to restore the status quo, and of course, vilified those who let their hair down too liberally under the influence of gin. Suddenly cocktails were less about revelry, and more about being well behaved in the eyes of society. With the moralists triumphing over the joyous gin-laden chaos, the narrative shifted from one of spirited independence to tired regimentation. The ladies who once laughed together over a shared bottle of gin now found themselves once again guided by societal pressures, trying to balance their newfound self along with the restrictions seeking to define them. But just because the gin craze faded doesn't mean the spirit of those women vanished. They had tasted the forbidden fruit, they had danced on the edge of propriety, and come out blazing with laughter. The rights they claimed and the freedom they demanded reverberated through generations, weaving a narrative of defiance that would echo through women's history. After all, who wouldn't celebrate through clinking glasses filled with gin, seeking flavour over tradition? So while the spirits may have calmed, the spark ignited in those merry moments of rebellion helped light the path for future generations of women ready to claim their independence, one bold sip at a time. Every good party must have a hangover, right? The gin craze left a bittersweet legacy that, like last night's snack pile in the morning light, shows the true colours of indulgences gone wrong. After the spirits, what residue remained? Let's explore the aftermath of a legacy muddier than a puddle after a quick downpour. Picture it now. The streets of London, once bustling with the sounds of daily life, now a cacophony of hiccups, shrieks, and the dramatic allure of a newly minted hangover. People picked themselves up from taverns that had become more like a glorified soup kitchen for the soul. Soup being a euphemism for the questionable beverages sloshing around. As they strolled home, clutching battered hats and questionable decisions, the true price of loyalty to gin became painfully evident. Spills to the sides of the road seemed like victims of an unending Sloppy Joe festival, making the cobblestones a slip and slide of sticky regret. But it wasn't just the floors that bore the weight of gin's legacy. It was the families that now struggled to piece themselves back together amidst the chaos. Relationships felt the sting of gin-induced discord, and while many sought solace in taverns, the illusion of camaraderie quickly dissolved like sugar in a tepid cup of water. How did Dad turn from a cupcake baker to an amateur opera singer belting out sad ballads to the moon? Why did family dinners morph into feasting frenzies fueled by fervent pitchers of gin? One moment everything was merry, the next minute Aunt Mabel's chin was spilling the secrets of 1,000 years, one gin-soaked word at a time. As we survey the demoralised streets of this once great city, it's paramount to appreciate that the aftermath held more than a few embarrassing moments. It was a veritable quagmire of social disorder. Town criers may as well have exchanged their news proclamations for pamphlets warning about the dangers of gin. While many drank, few seem to remember that memories are best left unblemished. The sound of bells announcing curfews rang as warnings that families were on the cusp of implosion. Irony was baking bread in the hours of gin-filled revelry. Notable figures in the community attempted to remedy the situation. Some brave souls leaned heavily into sobriety campaigns which, hilariously, were effectively like shouting at a cat that just stole your dinner. When was the last time you turned to a bunch of tipsy relatives and suggested they should switch to tea and biscuits instead, fully expecting to be taken seriously? The results were predictably chaotic as coping strategies often morphed into catastrophic phases of odd food choices and more aggressive political debates. The combination of sober conversations with tipsy rebuttals could send even the most stoic among them into spirals of exasperated laughter. And as the smoke of gin began to clear, the focus shifted to the alleged aftermath healthcare professionals dubbed the gin hangover effect. Debate sprouted around the importance of mental health and the roles families could play in supporting their loved ones. How, you ponder, Could it be that walking hand in hand with gin had morphed from a festive stroll to a circus of confessions? Enter the era of gin-fueled resolutions, when promises were made, but somehow never kept. It appears the only thing more elusive than sobriety after gin was the sincerity behind those New Year's resolutions. Indeed, historians would later refer to this time as the invisible brother of the Prohibition era, the hangover that lasted long after the spirits had dried up. Families slowly became the trailblazers of new habits, learning to bond over something other than burnt roast dinners and shameful escapades. They started exploring evening strolls in the parks, playing board games they hadn't touched in years, and yes, even learning to appreciate the fine art of sharing salad without tossing each other across the table out of sheer frustration. Cookbooks flourished, homemade bitters replaced costly distilleries, and the counterculture of fair sharing emerged in the homes that just survived a gin tornado. In the end, the gin craze did what few plausible calamities could. The shifty spirit laid bare the essence of community. It taught families just how far they could fall while still finding a reason to laugh together. The shadows of every hangover lingered like colourful ghosts, but unearthed a legacy rich in resilience, leaving one family to consider beautiful and absurd life moments like tucking in children without having to their pillage from the bottom of the barrel created a path away from excess and toward a sweeter sobriety. A new, albeit sticky chapter awaited to be written in the chronicles of their lives. So as remnants of gin slowly faded into memory, the legacy those fateful years carved still holds valuable lessons today. It may have taken London on a wild, dizzying ride, but what's more valuable is the sobering truth of laughter woven in love, and the sticky threads of humanity shared from the sidelines. As the gin craze pushed society to its limits, it also desked the way for a new era of spirits. The question is, how did society wring itself out like a damp sponge and find a way to ride the gin tide? A culinary renaissance led to gin becoming a revered beverage, deliciously crafted and occasionally pretentious. Picture the scene: the taverns of London buzzing with chatter, debates over gin quality spiralling into passionate disputes worthy of the Round Table. While the gin drinkers once slumped against the walls like overripe fruit, they began to rise, lifting their glasses with renewed vigour, albeit still wobbling slightly. This was a time when bartenders took on the role of mixologists, showing off their flair like acrobats in a circus. The art of cocktail making started to blossom alongside the gin craze, much to everyone's surprise, as if gin had decided it was not just a drink but an entire performance piece. The phrase gin parlours took on a whole new meaning. It was both a place to gulp and a hub for the social elite, decked out in their best frocks and cuffs, clinking glasses full of refined gin and tonic. How did it come to this? Let's chalk it up to sheer determination and a heavy dose of intoxication. Now, the gin concoctions being served were no longer of the bathwater variety. Brewers began experimenting, mixing botanicals that included everything from angelica root to licorice to create the nuances necessary for a tipple that wouldn't just make you forget your woes, but elevate your taste buds. Some individuals would even sip on elderflower-infused gin while gazing out over the London skyline, pondering the duality of life. A sublime drink meant to enhance their evening while they couldn't quite remember what day it was. Naturally, this newfound appreciation for gin led to an explosion of distilleries sprouting up like weeds in a neglected garden. Each establishment clamoured for attention, competing to concoct more interesting blends than the last, as if they were engaged in a high-stakes game of who could out-hip the hipster. Each distillery proclaimed their gin to be the ultimate quaff, kind of like a craft beer competition minus the 9 different types of hops. The dapper gentlemen of the era would passionately debate which gin was the finest, even while their wives secretly whispered that they'd polished off 2 bottles last week. But as with all good things, the gin renaissance came with its challenges. While the elite were busy swirling their drinks in fancy glasses, the working class folks continued to hold a loving embrace with their cheap gin concoctions, often mixed with dubious additives. Imagine a worker nursing a cup of gin mixed with whatever was left on the kitchen counter, maybe last week's vegetable scraps or some stale bread. The pursuit of refined spirits quickly turned bittersweet as the social divide widened, serving as a constant reminder that not all who desired gin could discern its artisanal varieties. Even industry leaders began to panic. What happens when the masses started turning up to their doors demanding nothing but the finest liquid gold? The outrage, and the cries of "there's more to life than just gin," echoed through upscale salons, creating a minor uproar among the gentry class. It was as if the spirits themselves were whispering, "Be careful, dear friends, you may just become too sophisticated for your own good." Fast forward through the 18th century, and gin finally morphed into something respectable, almost elegant. You'd find it adorned with botanicals that looked suspiciously like they'd staged an elaborate fashion show just to impress customers. Bars transformed into sophisticated lounges, complete with chandeliers that were far too ornate for a building that once housed a rickety bar. And instead of stumbling through drunken brawls, patrons leaned into meaningful conversations about life, love, and the depths of gin, after a few sips, of course. Was it blissful evolution? Sure. But the question lingers. Did the pandemonium of the gin craze truly leave an enduring legacy? The answer is yes. It paved the way for what we see today, from the speakeasies of the Prohibition era to the high-end distilleries flaunting their craft gin, offering us infusions made with more care than people once devoted to selecting which shoe to wear. The rise of gin from pandemonium to palate serves as an indelible reminder. We can sweep ourselves off the floor, sometimes literally, and turn chaos into class, one sip at a time. Cheers to gin then, gin now, and hopefully gin forever. Not only did children drink gin, but it also bolstered friendships and created bonds wherever it flowed. But how exactly did gin rise from local tabernas to an unshaken icon? Let's sip on that transition. In the early 18th century, gin houses popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, often open for business long before the sun had the sense to rise. These raucous venues became the primary drinking spots for London's working-class citizens, where a pint of gin was cheaper than a loaf of bread. Imagine trading away your dignity for a drop of liquid gold in a grim tavern, cluttered with the remnants of last night's escapades. The smell of stale sweat, spilled liquor, and either laughter or tears punctuating the air like an off-pitch string ensemble. So, how did gin transform from a lowly distillation made in cramped basements to a drink of choice? For starters, it became accessible. John Black, a savvy entrepreneur, pioneered the gin craze by allowing anyone with a knack for distilling to create their own version of this spirited elixir. Thus, gin began its delightful transition from underground bootlegging to a full-blown pub sensation. Pubs, once reserved for social class elitism, opened their doors wide, welcoming in the masses, promising that a pint of gin smoothed over all ills. It was the original liquid courage, if you will, allowing gentlemen to bestow heartfelt compliments on unapproachable barmaids and enabling timid souls to leap fearlessly into awkward conversations about the weather or rogue pigeons. And oh, the atmosphere in these establishments was nothing short of electric. Picture it. A cacophony of voices blending with the clinking of glasses, the occasional brawl breaking out over a particularly heated gin debate, and some likely butcher shouting, "No gin allowed in my realm." The taverns became vibrant hubs of community life, busy with the splendid chaos of sailors trading travel tales and locals discussing the latest happenings or disasters around town. If you found yourself waist-deep in the camaraderie of gin, this social melting pot offered freely shared tales of love, loss, adventure, and sometimes regrettable decisions, all in the hope of another round. But as with all good things, the fun spiralled out of control, and gin houses soon began bearing the brunt of public scrutiny. The clamour of tempers and belly laughs quickly transformed into wails of despair from families torn apart by mother's little helper. The very essence of gin that kindled friendships could just as easily lead to chaos, a double-edged sword, if you will. Children were left unregulated, peddling this spirit with wide eyes, anomalies roaming the streets clutching sweetened gin instead of apples. The government, fighting tooth and nail to temper the boozy chaos, eventually intervened. The Gin Act of 1751 emerged like a superhero swooping in to save the day, or at least attempt to rein in the revelry. Outlawing unlicensed gin houses, it redirected the popularity towards established establishments, presenting the idea that not all gin was created equal. Suddenly, class distinctions crept back into the drinking culture. Great news for respectable folk seeking a gin and tonic to soothe their nerves, but terrible for those who viewed drinking as the great equalizer. Yet, from this upheaval arose a new era, where the distinction between good and bad gin began to blur, and gin making became a craft. Distillers began pouring their art into crafting more refined products, the likes of which you wouldn't find in a rundown tavern. Have you ever seen a label on a bottle promising botanicals that hinted at fairy dust? No? Just me? Nevertheless, the rebranding of gin turned it into something akin to liquid poetry served in gleaming crystal glasses, transcending its humble beginnings and arriving at posh parties, where friends toasted to successes with renewed vigour and celebratory flair. In the end, gin's journey from local taverness to an unshaken icon illustrates just how flexible the human spirit can be, just as the beverage itself morphs and distills depending on the time, place, and who happens to be mixing it. Amid the turmoil and tumult, gin managed to evolve, weaving itself into the fabric of society, holding a mirror up to both the raucous joys and the darker shadows of Georgian London. So the next time you take a sip from your own glass, spare a thought for the liquid that once united and divided a city, all in one cheerful, drunken swirl. Imagine a world where gin enthusiasts put on their best shoes, parade through town, and sample every witch's brew this side of the Thames, all in the name of finding the ultimate drink. Ah, the lengths families went to in search of leisurely pursuits, invigorated by the pursuit of the right gin. Picture it. Bustling streets lined with peddlers and taverns, each offering their own signature concoction of gin. It was an intoxicating parade of flavours, each bottle boasting a story almost as bizarre as the people willing to drink it. Every Saturday, families would gather to embark on this weekly quest, an expedition fuelled by guts and perhaps a few too many pints of over-concocted pottage. Streets were crowded, not just with people, but with hopes of finding the mother of all gin. Will this one make me sing like a soloist at a choir, or just wail in despair? Line the thoughts of the brave souls walking towards yet another dimly lit corner pub. The ethos of a weekend was transformed from rest to an adventurous competition. Who could spot the latest gin innovation? Spoiler, it wasn't just about the quality of the drink, but also the theatrics surrounding it. Soon, entire communities transformed their weekends into tightly organised gin fairs. Families exchanged recipes while holding up their drinks like precious trophies. "Have you tried the latest craze?" someone would whisper, only to have it drown beneath the clitter-clatter of glasses and boisterous laughter. It felt less like a social gathering and more like a race for survival. Survival of the fittest, or perhaps the most drunken, as families pitted their recipes and concoctions against one another in a surge of competitive spirit. But let's not forget the tales that emerge from these gin-tasting galas. Two gentlemen, one sporting a fine, frilly cravat, and the other wearing no less than a three-piece suit, dove into a spirited debate about the merits of two particular gin brands, the classic London Dry versus a new, experimental brew called Gordon's Clear Enigma. It's a conversation that quickly meandered into realms of biblical proportions. Who could really claim the title? Reigning gin masters of the London scene. And in true human fashion, fists began to fly over nothing more than competing ideas of flavour. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the tavern owners lined their pockets like some mid-18th century monopoly. "Gather round, good people," they shouted, selling gin from barrels decorated with more flair than a royal affair. "One sip and you'll be convinced this is the elixir of life." And as customers sipped and gurgled, they bought into every ounce of marketing and swagger thrown their way. Without a care for hangovers waiting for them at home, families became loyal disciples of dubious gin brands. Ah, the bliss of ignorance mixed with the sheer thrill of exploration. However, as with many adventures steeped in questionable decisions, there was a predictable downturn. Families discovered that overindulgence inevitably led to not just flamboyant tales of bravery, but also whispers of regret revisited during sober moments. Once the revelry subsided, whispers of where Ginny had ended up at the end of the night were exchanged amongst tavern regulars and community members alike. I heard he danced on the table, serenading the cat while wrestling a barrel tap, someone would claim, and another would counter with tales of Ale's true adventure. But the real humour lay in the transformation of the mundane into the legendary. A mild-mannered neighbour, often seen tending to his flower garden, could suddenly claim the status of Gin Semper for his prowess at this supposedly noble pursuit. From casually gardening to championing the renowned drunks of the town, how did that happen? It showcased the sheer silliness that this gin craze had inspired, where every transaction and beverage was an opportunity to exchange tales and laughter. Ultimately, this humdrum groping for the exquisite joy of gin morphed entire communities. Each family returned to their homes ricocheting with laughter, occasionally stopping in horror as the reflections in the glass declared their hazy tales of triumphs. They would love to recount the gin quest stories, half filled with brimming pride and half traced with a certain blurry shame when it came to next week's meetings. As such, gin became more than just a beverage. It was a bonding agent, an intruder, and at times an impromptu comedy tour, proving that even in the depths of a glass, the right company could elevate spirits, albeit in ways they never intended. And so the Gin Jubilee continued, an absurd yet charming adventure for families everywhere, caught in a delightful whirlpool of laughter, camaraderie, and perhaps too many nights spent singing to the stars cheers to that too. Every drink has its legends, and gin is no different. From the goofy cling of jumbled tales to ethereal encounters with larger-than-life characters, there were stories at every corner. What silly folklore and urban legends might arise when gin is the main ingredient? In Georgian London, gin didn't just flow. It spilled forth like a fountain of spectacular absurdity. Picture this: a dashing highwayman, roguish grin plastered across his face, claiming he could outrun a horse because he once drank 5 tankards of gin for breakfast. Is it pure bravado, or does gin somehow infuse him with supernatural speed? The truth is, while he might have stumbled after a few blocks, his tale became the stuff of legend, feeding the imaginations of those still nursing their own hangovers. And then there was the infamous Gin Lane in London, where the streets were said to be paved with lost souls and spilled gin, creating a wobbly, sticky trail that led right to madness. Local gossip claimed that if you walked barefoot through Gin Lane, you'd be imbued with a sense of invincibility, resulting in everything from impromptu disco parties to goats being crowned as the new mayor. Why? Because why not? After enough gin, a goat is as qualified as anyone on the city council. Who really wanted to dive into the consequences of electing the next person who might actually care about public service? These stories, however, didn't just revolve around hilarious mishaps. Enter the famous Gin Fairy, a cheeky spirit said to flit about brazenly stealing sips from unsuspecting drinkers. If you woke up with a raging headache and an inexplicable desire to sing sea shanties, you could blame your alcohol-fueled folly on this mischievous little sprite. Rumours swirled that she visited taverns at closing time, granting non-verbal wish fulfillment, "May your snooze button be forever pressed, and your pint forever full, with no repercussions tomorrow morning." Drinking gin also became entwined with supernatural beliefs. A common myth was that if you consumed enough of the spirit and then danced under a full moon, you'd hear the whispers of spirits long departed. Spontaneous seances became a prevalent pastime in homes across London, where laughter mingled with shadows as folks attempted to contact their ancestors, often with spectacularly embarrassing results. Great-great-uncle Gerald, how's the afterlife? I'm pretty sure he said you should have tried the gin and tonic last Thursday. Beyond belly laughs and goosebumps, gin became a means of social connection. Local folklore told that drinking a shared drum-sized barrel of gin guaranteed lifelong friendships, or at the very least, lifelong embarrassing stories. Why bother meeting your neighbours over cups of tea when you could all pledge your undying love with a round of shots? With every clink of a glass, tales grew taller, romances crafted and friendships forged. People embraced the spirit's warm embrace, often discovering a newfound sense of camaraderie, albeit swaying precariously on unsteady feet. However, not all gin stories ended in party hats and laughter. Tales of the ghostly drunk emerged, where the whispers claimed that if you drank gin with regret shrouding your heart, a spirit would cling to your soul, weighing you down. The drunken sort of metamorphosis was said to alter personalities and reshape lives, often revealing a level of introspection sorely lacking in the raucous gin-soaked populace. It became a cautionary tale: drink responsibly, or prepare for a wraith-like haunt every time you reach for a bottle. So, as you wrap yourself around these stories of sorrow and joy, remember this: in the world of gin, absurdity reigns supreme, from the chaotic bonding sessions on Gin Lane to the mischievous Gin Fairy and ghostly visits. Whether you recount tales of laughter shared over misbegotten espressos or awkward encounters with long-departed spirits, gin remains a sticky thread woven into the fabric of Georgian history. Grab a drink, raise your glass skyward, and perhaps let your imagination take flight during your next glorious toast. After all, it's only a matter of time until someone starts passing down this folklore like it's gospel. And you know, after a few pints, you'll become the story's next protagonist. Cheers to that. Who needs Fashion Week when you have men and women parading down the streets looking properly dishevelled, bloodshot, and perhaps slightly confused? Georgian London saw an intersection of fashion and gin, where high society didn't draw the line often enough, and attire was less complimented and more ceremony. Imagine a bustling street where the only thing more extravagant than the satin coats and powdered wigs was the sheer number of people wobbling toward the nearest gin shop. It was a theatrical display of fabric and folly, where the latest Parisian styles met the awkward missteps of a gin-induced haze. As you stroll through these cobblestone streets, scenting the air with a delightful mix of horse manure and last night's gin from the neighbouring tavern, you observe the way women desperately try to maintain an aura of grace, their grand dresses trailing behind them like forgotten dreams. With skirts so wide they could double as sails in a storm, they were practically earning their own right to complain about public transportation. The corsets, designed to accentuate a figure, now hugged squishy midsections after too many humble gin cocktails. Picture them squeezed into garments tighter than Aunt Marge's hugs, and the risk of a wardrobe malfunction always loomed larger than a hangover. Meanwhile, the men weren't exactly setting the runway ablaze with sophistication. Those powdered wigs that had all the elegance of a poodle. They travelled the street bravely, despite being matted by splashes of questionable spirits and the occasional pigeon droppings. One gentleman's attempt at charm was undercut by the visible stain on his shirt, a relic of the last drink he'd tried to juggle while impressing a lady. Each step was a delicate negotiation between the willingness to lean into fashion and the peril of being a laughingstock preemptively. But here's the twist. While the fashions of Georgian London were designed to evoke admiration, they were also designed to withstand the inevitable disasters caused by too many gins. Forget about last night's outfit. People lived in fear of that unpredictable spill, which always seemed to find its way onto the most opulent fabrics. A bender could cut short a dinner party for fear of returning in a wine-soaked portrait, but at least you could count on the company of other tipsy partygoers wearing matching disasters. Let's not ignore the gin aficionados flaunting their homemade styles, sporting patches of embroidery with impressively layered patterns that screamed, "I have a talent for craft," or perhaps I've had too much gin and forgot how to sew straight. Women sporting elaborate hats perched precariously atop scraped hair, while their heads fused with a slightly skewed sense of balance started to understand the nuances of what not to wear. Not every gin-induced outfit was going to score a spot at the top of society's hierarchy, but at that moment who cared? Meanwhile, in just darkened corners of smoky taverns, the narrative veered into the absurd. A gaggle of women sporting frayed shawls definitely weren't privy to the latest runway trends, but were absolutely in the business of evaluating gin quality. By some divine act of rebellion, they declared the best sips must come with the most acceptable, or flaunted runoff from the flourishing casks in the neighbourhood. Fashion became secondary to the surprising delight of parading through the streets with a bottle, still wearing that same dress you bought 3 seasons ago. But hey, nothing says I'm classy like gin-stained silk. Rumour has it that during one drunken escapade, a noble lady was convinced to swap her elegant ensemble for the tavern keeper's flamboyant attire, thus starting a new trend, the drunken swap. Night after night became an endless cycle of dare-driven fashion revolutions where garb and gin weren't merely identified with style but were firmly stitched into the social fabric of their time. And while one can't help but chuckle at the correlation between fabric and folly, one truth remains. Fashion allowed for a little laughter amid the chaos. Those onlookers could appreciate the spectacle of confused grandeur and heightened absurdity amidst gin-soaked revelries. So as night fell, and families stumbled home with outfits that looked like modern art gone wrong, one thing was for certain. There was not just room for style, but an entire genre of history smeared in gin stains, laughable conversations, and a deeply fragile sense of dignity. After all, if you're going to trip over your own feet in a gilded gown, you may as well be doing it with a smile and a solid drink in hand. The 1700s brought gentry forward, but let's take a deeper look at how an entire social class became indebted, in every sense of the word, to the charms of gin. Imagine how the upper crust turned into an assorted collection of drunken fools at fancy gatherings while sporting the latest wigs. They strutted about in their powdered finery, trailing a scent of gin and regret, mistaking etiquette for actual social skill. Fancy balls morphed from splendid soirees into competitions for who could hold the most gin without collapsing into a puddle of fancy rags and remorse. Ever tried to do the cha-cha while tipsy? One good turn and you've transformed into a wobbly statue adorned in satin, desperately trying to convince everyone that this latest invention, the gyrating jig, was an art form. Now picture the refined table settings, brimming with finger sandwiches and crystal goblets. You'd think this was a scene from a Jane Austen novel. Instead, it was a backdrop for a contest where the crude attempts at civility met with sloshing gin cocktails, the contestants carrying on like comedic characters battling for the dramatic spotlight. Wealthy gentlemen, let's call them Sir Drunkalot, and Lord Tipsy Bottom, would regale the crowd with increasingly ridiculous tales of gallantry, only to have their beloved stories drowned out by the clattering of their own spillage. Raise your glasses, my lords and ladies, don't spill the gin, or you'll upset the readily available cornucopia of polite society, or rather, the breakdown thereof. The gin craze swept through the ranks of the gentry like wildfire in a hayfield, igniting passions for mischief over moderation. With all that money and little sense, lavish parties became the norm. It was as if the gentry, high on illicit spirits and elaborate wigs, decided that decorum was just a suggestion, much like no running in the halls in a kindergarten classroom. People who once prided themselves on eloquence ended up growing more fond of inebriated poetry recitations. Who needs Shakespeare when you can spin dramatic limericks about losing a shoe in a back alley? Limericks about debauchery became the bread and butter of gentry gatherings, whispered conspiratorially while sneaking that last flask behind a potted fern. What could go wrong, you ask? Well, quite a lot, dear listener. One evening, at a particularly spirited soiree, a young earl mistook his sister's prize pigeon for a fellow partygoer and challenged it to a duel. Spoiler, the pigeon won, and the earl spent the next week recovering from bites that were apparently too embarrassing to explain to the family physician. Witnesses claimed the entire debacle was hysterically funny, as the gentry rushed to fortify the house with crumpled velvet cushions in hopes of cushioning whatever embarrassment came next. As gin continued to entwine itself with gentrified society, it also unearthed the absurdity of class-bound expectations, if the common folks were. Frequenting taverns for some rogue imbibing fun, the gentry had transformed their posh parlours into new-age speakeasies, turning long-standing social etiquette into mere suggestions, rather like how people in your office treat business casual. With the promise of gin flowed new layers of relatability, as barons became bonded through their shared propensity to make total spectacles of themselves. Did they care that Lady Grizzlebottom could barely piece her sentences together after 2 rounds of gin punch? No, dear friends. They raised glasses as pints of laughter echoed in the same way an opera might have once commanded silence. And as these silly antics spiralled out of control, social observers and moralists gritted their teeth. Suddenly the gentry that once held society together began to look like a band of ragtag performers auditioning for the role of fools of the court. No longer were they just arbiters of taste. They had transcended into theatrical revellers suited more to a farce than a gala. Life had become a stage, but the players lacked any script worth following. In the frenzy of gin-soaked debauchery, lessons were learned, or rather, disregarded altogether. Applause awaited those who gave in to the joyous chaos while collecting more and more outlandish tales of drunken attempts to flatter tobacco-smoking owls or having complex debates with a parlour cat. The gentry's debauchery created ridiculous bonds that traversed the shallow waters of decorum and uncovered a fraternity built on giggles, gin, and regret. A comical yet tragic representation of an era spinning out of dignified control. Thus, dear friends, amidst slapstick madness and cascading gin, Georgian London discovered something valuable. To laugh is to live, and if gin offered nothing else, it granted unflinching hilarity in the face of respectable absurdity. Don't worry if an invitation to dance went awry, or if a story became too tall. What mattered was the second glass filled with spirits, and the laughter erupting at the frivolity coursing through society as they wobbled toward their next adventure. Let me know when you would like me to continue with the next segment. Imagine the constabulary having to deal with a drunken populace more disruptive than a choir on Valentine's Day. What was the life of someone tasked with keeping the peace amidst the gin-fueled chaos? The only enforcement weapon? Strong resistance and perhaps a choice of kickbacks. The gin craze led to a scene that would make even the most seasoned officer reconsider their career choice. Too many people wanting to sing, dance, or fight over a bottle, and far too few calming down to let the law do its job. The streets of London were an open-air circus, with police officers standing at the centre of it all, trying to balance law and order while the citizens around them knocked back another pint of chaos. First, let's consider the gear these brave officers were equipped with. Rigid truncheons reminiscent of angry walking sticks were their only means of force. Pretty unimpressive in a battleground where opinionated drunks and stubborn wasps nested in the same drunkard's tavern. If a brawl broke out, a bobby had to choose. Do they swing that baton, risking a pint shower from both sides, or do they plead with the fighters to please sit down and resolve their issues via a civilized debate? Spoiler alert, most of the time, the choice was obvious. To make matters worse, the very laws that the constables were expected to enforce didn't always seem fair, or even professionally necessary. Take the Gin Act of 1736, for instance, which levied heavy taxes on gin sales and pushed the previously joyous gin merchants underground. Suddenly gin wasn't just a drink, it was an illicit treasure hiding under sideways glances and greasy tables, making the officers' jobs even murkier. How do you uphold the law on a beverage that had suddenly turned into a state secret? Imagine needing a badge and a trench coat, but being told you also had to don a fedora and dodge bets at the same time. Meanwhile, desperate officers began to discover that enforcing the gin laws included the especially tragic aspect of fighting temptation themselves. With booze at every street corner, it was practically a taunt that forced officers to contend with their own craving. What else could be expected from a worn copper belt when you've witnessed the absolute mayhem of half your district belly laughing over the umpteenth gin bucket? Tiny vloggers of the time hadn't even invented crafting a cocktail yet. Each guilty sip became a challenge. Can I resist another gin fizz while I pretend to be the moral compass of this entire town? And let's not forget the popular opinion of the officers being as beloved as a cabbage in a child's diet. Officers tended to be viewed as self-important nags, far more interested in enforcing the law than letting parties run wild. If one were to ask the townsfolk, gin was a right. Officers, just figures in poorly tailored uniforms. Why listen to a copper when the promise of gin is just down the road? In time, the streets morphed into a faint echo of a raucous tavern. The officers began creating their own code of conduct, one that mixed sober enforcement with professional acceptance of disorder. They had unwittingly become the plus-fours of personal safety, ever grinning yet battle-weary, a brigade ready for anything except finding tidiness in their duty. Let's just say making arrests was as visible as a well-timed hiccup. Did they begin to rely on comedic diplomacy to ease the chaos? Of course. Peddling jokes and pub stories became a much-needed strategy. While some officers turned to winks and nods to diffuse tensions, others joined in the tomfoolery. What's a little laughter after all, as long as the brawling boiled down to slapstick hilarity rather than genuine violence? So every now and then, in the middle of a drunken quarrel over who lost a bet or who dared to snatch the last drop, a constable would throw in a quip just to shake things up. Each tough day on duty brought moments both laughable and chaotic. If things got too rowdy, whatever strategy worked best was deployed. In the lawless land that Gin created, nothing ever stayed strictly within the law. The era became a game of cat and mouse. Only the mouse is constantly sloshed and the cat is more interested in finding solace in gin than chasing after sanity. As the dust settled on a particularly wild night, the officers had to remind themselves, while gin might have been fueling conflicts, it also wove a curious sense of community, one that might just turn into smiles, tears and impromptu ballads after a long hard day in Georgian London. So, the next time you hoist a glass or hear the raucous fun in your neighbourhood pub, spare a thought for the officers of those early gin raves. They may have stood amidst the antics, armed only with a hat, a stick and an unwavering sense of humour, but they also found camaraderie in a bit of chaos, and that is worth toasting to, gin or no gin. As the gin craze escalated, the government decided their hands were tied, with sticky fingers, launching campaigns to regulate the boozy debacle. But how did government involvement turn the fun into a battleground, where gin became an outlaw and became a part of the very fabric of resistance? It's almost like watching a toddler discover fire, exciting, chaotic, and prone to burn everything to the ground. Imagine a world where the goblet of joy was not just the centre of merriment, but also the magistrate's greatest headache. The officials in charge realised that something had to be done when Thursday afternoon became a boisterous holiday from responsibilities, leading to riots over missing gin rations. The situation was so dire that it warranted a bureaucratic response more complex than a middle school science project, higher taxes on gin, licensing laws, and moral panics akin to church sermons preaching about the devil himself sneaking into the barrel. The government introduced the Gin Act of 1736, which was supposed to curb the madness. They imagined it as a magic wand that would put an end to the gin-soaked chaos that had the lower classes staggering through the streets like drunken zombies in search of brains, preferably still attached to a human soul. The law imposed a hefty tax on gin sellers, believing that hitting them where it counts, right in the pocket, would sober everyone up. But people didn't just sit there. No, they decided to play gin cat and mouse with the authorities, continuing to drink as if they were fulfilling a sacred prophecy. One unequivocally absurd fact about gin consumption: it didn't just remain popular, it ballooned. Nothing says rule of law like sneaking that forbidden bottle of gin out of an unlicensed tavern and swigging it behind the stables like a covert operation. Suddenly, gin wasn't just a cheap drink, it was a rebellious act. It grew into an emblem of resistance, a way for the masses to thumb their noses at the ruling class as they clink their glasses while shouting, "Down with gentry, up with gin." The taverns became a battleground of their own, filled to the brim with raucous laughter, slurred speeches, and the unmistakable scent of stale spirits infused with a hint of despair. You'd almost think the locals had formed a union along the lines of the Gin and Join fraternity. And in this climate of supposed sobriety, of cracked laws and fuzzy morals, families became ensnared in a web of guilt and grievance. As gin was demonised for creating chaos, families once bonded over their drinking escapades began to bicker over the price of an evening pint versus the cost of their next meal. Is that amazing or tragic? It's like two sides of the same coin, flipped by a drunken master at the local fair. Ever thought about how confusing that would feel? One minute you're clinking glasses, cheering survival. The next, you're dodging the tax man while pondering your family's future over last night's hangover. Armed with newfound taxes and licensing laws, the government hit the streets with a renewed vigour, engaging in numerous raids of illegal gin shops, often encountering bizarre flurries of resistance from the local denizens. Law enforcement officers barged into back alleys only to find quite possibly the most absurd forms of protest. A crowd of people chanting, "One more round," while hugging barrels like they were long-lost pals. To make matters worse, these drunken gatherings began to accumulate an aura reminiscent of festive protests. Signs proclaiming "no gin, no justice" became shockingly common and oddly festive. Through it all, gin wasn't a mere habit anymore. It was a symbol of identity, and the government's crackdown propelled it into underground folklore. By the time the government intensifies their efforts, gin's reputation turned from that of a harmless libation to that of a dangerous seductress, a siren leading society straight to behavioural chaos. Government attempts at control morphed the populace's relationship with gin, leaving families battling not just financial woes, but also navigating the treacherous waters of social expectations. Sobriety? Who needed that when you could have an abysmally good time at the gin shop? Here's the rub. In a world of moral panic and high-stakes legislation, an entire culture not only thrived but also redefined the meaning of community under the absurd gaze of gin-fueled escapades. So, while kings and queens debated policy, the streets of Georgian London thrummed with laughter and the clinking of glasses, flamboyant rebellion against authority, all thanks to a little something we like to call gin. Who knew that within the chaos lay not just a beverage, but a story of resilience against the odds, where families struggled to reclaim joy amidst the urban carnage? Take a bow, gin. You've truly earned your spot as history's most entertaining villain. Years later, as the madness began to wane, the question became, how do you return society to sanity? Let's ponder the public's attempt to ease the chaos and convince each other that perhaps just one drink could be enough, in a crowded world where everyone's sworn under the euphoric spell of gin. Picture this. It's the early 19th century, and suddenly the party is over. Everyone wakes up squinting into the sunrise as the fog of gin slowly lifts. Faces that once boasted smiles now show the horrifying realization they might have used a goat for a pillow during last night's revelry. The great gin craze left behind a dazzling array of turmoil, colourful tales, and of course, a hefty dose of regret. People began to gather at what they called sober soirées. These weren't your average tea parties, mind you. No, they were extravagant displays of sobriety. Imagine the enthusiasm that would ensue as individuals clinked crystal glasses filled with sparkling water instead of gin, yelling cheers, like it was the latest trend. So what if there was no gin to toast with? Enthusiasm makes up for taste, right? As the sobriety movement gained its footing, they distributed pamphlets urging friends to replace gin with wholesome beverages like healthful broths and, believe it or not, herbal teas. "Boil your greens," they chanted, as if the kale revolution had just suffered a setback. But let's take a moment to step back and understand the absolute absurdity of demands for tea parties in place of gin benders. The irony practically drips from the pages of history. These gatherings usually turned into competitions over who could concoct the most pleasingly ludicrous herbal tea blend. Did Mrs. McDougall make her blend out of dried nettles and peppermint leaf? Oh, how daring! You'd have Mrs. Bentley trying to outdo her by brewing chamomile with a hint of rosemary, because nothing says I've conquered gin like a cup of dried flowers. These members clinked non-alcoholic glasses and vowed to never again succumb to the siren call of gin. Meanwhile, society was also trying to find a way to address the gin plague that had turned family gatherings into a series of unintended stand-up performances. Here comes the moral reform movement, whose members, perhaps somewhat ironically, gathered each week for ginless tea parties with a sprinkle of righteous indignation. Their pitch? They wanted families to reside in the sanctity of sobriety. That said, they were possibly in for a rough ride. Picture a group of sober adults so taken by this new idea that they end up discussing their struggles with everyone's laughable attempts at socialising while tilting bottles. If there were ever an opening scene for a Shakespearean comedy of errors, it would undoubtedly take place in one of these sober meetings. Parents shifted their focus from drink to what the children were consuming. They wanted to foster the next generation devoid of gin-induced shenanigans. So, fun morphed from giggling over a shared bottle to engaging in wholesome activities. Families began to plant communal gardens, because every old wife's tale needed a farm-to-table aspect. Picture dads in waistcoats teaching their kids how to grow carrots, an enticing alternative to tumbling out of the pub, wouldn't you agree? But let's not fool ourselves. These new habits didn't come without their hiccups. Older children who had grown up in gin-slicked homes suddenly had to transition into the world of responsible ginless living. Parents would catch their teenagers sipping from what they thought was a cheeky bottle of ale, only to discover it was actually lemonade. Cue dramatic music and flashbacks of rebellious escapades. Is it lemonade? Is it gin? Can we ever truly know, they might wonder, spouting pseudo-philosophies at the breakfast table over soggy toast. All this comedic chaos aside, the struggle for sobriety and sanity turned into a delicate dance, where families learned to appreciate each other's quirks outside of booze-fueled antics. As they raked leaves instead of drinks and shared stories that didn't require a safety buffer of gin, the balance of family life began to adapt, allowing room for laughter that didn't carry the sharp branding of a gin hangover. Laughter returned, not the raucous, slurred laughter of tipsy nights, but that genuine, heartfelt laughter that marks a moment of rib-tickling joy. So, as everyone finally managed to taper their relationship with gin, they learned that family bonds could flourish, even without the assistance of slightly embattled spirits. The beautiful irony of it all. What began as a pursuit of gin-induced bliss transitioned into a renaissance of connection, one tea party at a time. The world had turned a page and through the haze realised that perhaps the true tonic was always found not in a bottle, but indeed right there in each other. A toast to the struggle! With gin's fun wrapped up in its own confusion, how did families reshape their lives, and which stories survived the bumpy ride became something to cherish? Life lessons learned might have been muddled with gin, but lessons believed aren't easily shaken. You'd think that after stumbling blindly through the streets of Georgian London, singing the praises of one sprite-filled jubilee after another, families would learn a thing or two about moderation. But alas, the hangover of the gin craze left a staggering legacy, one that forced communities to pick themselves up from the cobblestones and rethink their relationship with both spirit and sanity. Imagine stepping out into the blaring sunlight after years of practically stapling gin to your hand. The first order of business? Maybe learn the difference between a clinking glass and clinking coins. Because guess which one is still a bad investment? People gathered in desolate pubs, not for another round, but for discussions of how to make sense of their incredibly messy lives. This was when the phrase, the morning after, took on a whole new meaning, overflowing with the kinds of stories that became legend, valiant attempts to reclaim family values amid a backdrop of yet another gin-fueled spree. Families often convened to share their wretched tales over cups of tea, not just eucalyptus-infused oolong, but that bittersweet brew called life lesson. Picture a mother recounting the day her husband placed a bet with a stranger after 2 flagons of gin, only for that stranger to turn out to be an equally inebriated chimney sweep who left with a grander prize, a chunk of the family's savings. What a price to pay for a night out on the town. You can imagine the gentle, reflective nods as families agreed that perhaps less gin and more savings might be the new mantra. Unsurprisingly, the gin-induced chaos also led to what folks in the neighbourhood cheerfully referred to as family bonding, because nothing creates solidarity like reminiscing over shared blunders. With the air reeking of gin-soaked regrets, many became experts in the art of family therapy, primarily through the very British pastime of making fun of each other's calamities. Picture a bustling kitchen, where petty grievances transformed into laugh-out-loud skits. Remember that time Uncle Ginny danced on the dining table, thinking he was auditioning for a play he'd never heard of? Echoed through the rooms, laughter bouncing off the walls like leftover bubbles from a gin fizz. But while laughter sprouted in the shadows of gin-fueled sorrows, many also sought ways to rebuild not just their stories but their lives. Suddenly communities were filled with entering alcohol-free zones. Tea houses emerged, where the only spirits on hand were the uplifting camaraderie and freshly baked scones. Substituting a pub crawl for a tea journey wasn't just a trend. It became a social revolution of pouring clarity, one biscuit at a time. For some families, this transition led to more serious discussions about the health of their kin. As children grew, so did awareness. What if we talked about the dangers of gin instead of just recounting how Dad danced on the table? Became the new, thought-provoking question. One brave mother even opened a pamphlet titled Life After Gin, which had a riveting cover graphic, an anthropomorphic gin bottle looking alarmingly regretful. Workshops taught families how to juggle responsibilities in the absence of their liquid friend, with slogans like, "Time to swap cocktail hour for story hour." Of course, there were discussions about social responsibility. Families became advocates for community health, as they recognised the toll their drinking had taken, not just on their wallets, but on their hearts too. Support groups sprouted, making room for camaraderie not derived from the raucous afterglow of gin, but rather from shared experiences of navigating life soberly. Before long, the Sober Society became a community favourite, where local storytelling was a trademark feature. As the dust slowly settled, the social fabric began to mend, but the scars remained, a reminder that healing takes time, patience, and an occasional awkward laugh over spilled tea. With tales of gin fading into memory, families emerge stronger than ever, illustrating how resilience often comes in the most manic of forms. So, here's to the remarkable journey Georgian London families took on their quest for sobriety. From corners of gin-soaked chaos to pockets of heartfelt laughter, they learned something invaluable. You can't just drink your troubles away. Sometimes, the real magic happens when you stand up, have a brew instead, and start weaving new tales to carry you through life. As families sat down to share those stories over steaming cups, they quietly toasted to the perfect blend of love, laughter, and resolved clarity. The best recipe yet for rebuilding lives post-gin frenzy. It's hard to hang up the dream of a careless night on the town. Families faced a sobering fact. How do you embrace sobriety after years spent in a sea of gin? What were the coping mechanisms people threw in their emotional toolbox when booze gets tossed away? The truth is, with the laughter and frivolity of gin-fueled escapades behind them, confronting life without a liquid sidekick felt like being tossed into the windy streets of London without a hat or a penny to your name. For many, the afternoons were so devoid of motivation that even the neighbourhood pigeons seemed to judge their existence. Imagine waking up on a Monday morning after years of tippling, your head echoing the sounds of the pub's uproarious laughter, only to find yourself staring at the same ugly wallpaper you had always sworn to replace. Your partner, who used to take one look at you through gin-tinted glasses and win your heart for the evening, now looks at you with concerned eyebrows and a whole heap of expectation. So, what's the plan now, they might ask, sweetly, trying not to sound like they just bet on the wrong horse in last night's race. And your only reply? A deep sigh mixed with a hint of panic, like a gnat trapped in an ale keg. Families suddenly found themselves in the awkwardly strange territory of actual conversations, no longer reliant on slurred words and drunken promises. They had to muster the courage to discuss the weather without inserting a gin reference. Who knew meteorology could sound so emotionally charged? "Looks like rain today," Dad would say with an earnestness that almost made everyone recoil. The household became a curious experiment in survival skills where, how do we fill our days without gin, was the burning question, eclipsing the truly pressing matters about the dinner leftovers. What about the habits they desperately offloaded? The collective conscience of these families flailed as they sought various alternatives like fiddling with puzzles, which offered less excitement than a riddle but still managed to drown out the overwhelming silence. Others turned to knitting, which for some was a quiet escape, while others transformed into frustrated yarn tornadoes, shouting at their slip knots like pommies at an England game. Of course, let's not forget the Sunday family meetings, which had miraculously become an actual structured event instead of an improvisational play. Picture all of them seated around the table, no drinks in sight, just a bowl of stale biscuits and a dozen raw emotions simmering in a far too serious atmosphere. The conversation often revolved around the unprecedented absurdity of it all. So let's talk about our feelings. Cue nervous laughter, a slight cough, and gasp, actual silence. Some families attempted to reclaim their old lives by surrounding themselves with wellness pamphlets and herbal teas, trading in gin pastries for kale smoothies and cucumber-infused water. Social detox, if you will. But let's be real, there's only so much leaf-like substance a human can consume before dreaming of the long-lost gin and tonic. You could almost hear the desperate pondering. Is that even a cocktail? Through it all had come newfound responsibilities. Dishes, laundry, and taking a real interest in how the kids were doing at school became focal points of life. The mundane transformed into unsung heroes of familial bonding. However, each task often seemed laced with an unexpected complexity, like deciphering a foreign language while also trying to balance on a pogo stick. Who knew parenting could come with such a steep learning curve? Ironically, as families adjusted to the new sobriety, bonds emerged that hadn't been noticed in the haze of habitual drinking. They learned together, laughed together, and, astonishingly, felt each other's presence without the old rinse and repeat of meeting with gin. As they discovered the beauty of connection without the veil of inebriation, families realized one simple truth. Embracing sobriety didn't mean sacrificing joy. It meant reclassifying what joy truly was. Days rolled on, transforming slowly. Friends and family became the new cadre of adventures rather than the sidekicks willing to drunkenly nod along to whatever nonsense was spewed at the end of darkness. When Friday night came around, it wasn't the liquor stores they flocked to. No, now they were headed to local fairs, dancing under the stars and experiencing boisterous joy through plain old reality. In the end, this struggle with sobriety became less about casting off gin entirely and more about rediscovering clarity. The connecting threads were now woven into the fabric of reality, a tapestry made up of laughter, love, and an appreciation for a life less blurred by spirits. And just like that, amid the mix of genuine conversations and authentic connections, a new chapter constructed itself, proving that families could rebound, revitalise and, dare we say, truly thrive once the foggy haze had lifted. As the dust settled and clear minds emerged, people grappled with how to enjoy life without their favourite alcoholic crutch. Were they crafting new traditions or simply bracing for the next social experiment? as you'd guess, the process was hilarious. Imagine gatherings where the toasts included heartfelt sentiments rather than dubious propositions involving a round of gin, and where sharp elbows fighting for the last dregs of a beloved bottle turned into competitive board games. How does one even play Monopoly sober? Would they be able to withstand the awkwardness of unfiltered conversation without the golden elixir explaining their every misstep? People began brainstorming creative ways to replace the mind-numbing bliss of gin with something less likely to lead to tragic karaoke performances or unexpected rants about the virtues of pigeons. Suddenly, non-alcoholic punch became the drink of choice, bringing with it a vibrant rainbow of flavours, but alas, none of the courage. How did lemon-lime mix with ginger ale suddenly feel more like a group therapy session than an exhilarating party? Still they tried, clinking glasses and mumbling phrases like, "Here's to a fresh start," while wiping away the memories of sporadic brawls over bottle placements. As families reassembled from moments of drunken wanderings, they found themselves left with pleasant discomfort, a startlingly clear view of each other. "Oh look," one mother exclaimed, gazing at her teenage son. "You actually have legs and are reasonably tall." It was a revelation certainly worth avoiding the awkwardness of gin to discover. And yet, there was also a palpable yearning for the chaos that gin brought, the tension that transformed dull evenings into nocturnal adventures. Some families embraced the humour amidst the shift, holding themed nights where jokes were told and stories spun, often with heavy-handed exaggeration. Remember when Uncle Bertie shot his drink out of his nose after the cat stole his gin? Became a centrepiece for evenings, where they could reacquaint themselves with the art of storytelling, sober and slightly less ridiculous than in gin-fueled tales. It was a noteworthy achievement when their laughter transitioned from nervous giggles about past follies to genuine snorts and roars of the unfiltered bonding experience. The ginless era ushered in the delightful awkwardness of social activities that thrived on interaction rather than inebriation. Ever tried craft nights with knitting needles and wild ambition? Those were a treat for the senses, and discussions included lively debates about colour choices while trying not to poke your neighbour's eye out with your artisanal attempts at creation. "You call that a scarf?" became an even funnier line when you saw the haphazard mess produced by your cousin with their once daunting facade. Not to be outdone, families also began to scour the countryside for new adventures. Hikes, picnics, family. Game days by the riverside all emerged with an air of discovery. They set about creating rituals steeped in bonding humour. "Let's all hold hands and try not to trip over the runaway goat" became a thing. And yes, things did trip spectacularly, just without the risk of stumbling into the distilleries, singing senseless songs. And then came the food. Some genius proposed they could pair Sunday dinner with the occasional, but rare, white wine spritzer, serving multi-course meals that seemed grandiose enough to impress anyone. Their love for culinary attempts soared beyond expectations and often beyond comprehension. They swapped traditional gin and tonic for anything that looked green and healthy, often yielding drastically bizarre outcomes before realising successfully roasting a chicken could compete for culinary gold on a Sunday evening. Yet this newfound sobriety wasn't without its trials. The spectre of gin still loomed. Tempting reminders of the raucous fun that lay beneath its murky surface could creep back in any moment. Friends who returned with stories of adventures nicknamed Crazy Bish would gather, nudging people toward the allure of one more sip, and there it sat, daring them to touch it. "No, thank you, Fred. I like my dignity," became a rallying cry amid resounding belly laughs. Ultimately, like a good old gin hangover, they realised resilience was born out of these shared experiences, the laughter that erupted from their collective discomfort and newfound perspective on life. They learned that while gin may have transformed them into oblivious revellers, a clear mind could ignite creativity, connection, and memories that weren't just punchlines, but rather heartfelt tributes to the absurdity of human connection. So, they raised their glasses, filled with sparkling water this time, and toasted to recovery, family, and of course the manageable chaos that was their new adventure in life. Here's to authenticity. May it always bring enough humour to get you through a dry spell, and perhaps, just perhaps, a secret ingredient to spice things up once more in gin's infamous absence. Perhaps the tail end of the gin fiasco provided one last gift, a rediscovery of family in ways they'd never considered, but with a sprinkle of humour. How do you bond over tea after the chaotic journey of gin? Welcome to this new era, where laughter proliferates and a robust sense of humour can go a long way. Imagine going from drunken debates about the virtues of gin to serious discussions about tea with the family. How about some Earl Grey instead of Mr. Gin O'Clock, you might ask? This was not just a new drink, it was the dawn of a new approach to family gatherings. With gin's reign curbed, families began to replace raucous brawls with calming cups of tea. The new detox habits forced them to discover soothing moments together. Let's face it, they didn't have to listen to Uncle Reginald recount the same outlandish tale of his adventures at the pub, where he supposedly wrestled a bear and lost in spectacular fashion in a loopy haze. Now they sat around tables discussing the appropriate steeping time for a good cuppa. Too long, and you'll end up with something stronger than last night's gin, was the running joke. Ever wondered how family recipes change when the shame of gin is removed from the equation? Suddenly, grandmothers were pulling out age-old recipe books, flipping to those pages filled with comfort food, tea cakes, and biscuits instead of the more questionable mixtures concocted back in the day. Slow-roasted meats, delicate pastries, and scones shared the spotlight with friendly banter, as families unified under the banner of "this will definitely not ruin our day." In fact, dishes once overshadowed by pre-gin appetites now became a monumental family affair, as people rediscovered what it felt like to have fun together without needing a fermented spirit to ease the pain of reality. And let's be honest, re-establishing family ties was a lot easier without everyone tripping over their own shoes after a gin-fueled overload. Laughter, once drowned amidst the haze of tipples, now danced freely through the parlours. Picture everyone trying to find that harmony, like the awkwardness of a first date or a family reunion where everyone got mildly curious about what the last 3 decades looked like. For instance, Dad would mutter something resembling a compliment about the tea's aroma, but was secretly routing for someone to spill it just so they could laugh about it later. But it wasn't just about tea and biscuits. Families discovered shared interests anew, often bonding over the humorous misadventures that gin had inspired. Do you remember when Jennifer tried to sing "God Save the Queen" to the cat? Became a frequent punchline, followed by fits of uncontrollable giggles. The cat, thanks to gin-induced antics, became somewhat of an unintentional mascot, immortalised in family tales. A furry generational hero that, quite frankly, deserved a medal for surviving that episode. As ridiculous as it sounds, the aftermath of the gin craze was transforming family dynamics in ways few would have predicted. Families gathered now not only to share stories, but to embark on absurd activities together. A rousing game of charades substituted those intense moments of gin-fueled drama. I bet I can mime a platypus better than you can remember the night you mistook a hedge for a urinal, you quipped. And suddenly everyone was doubled over in laughter again. What about the siblings who used to squabble over the last bit of gin? They now had a new way to bond. Creative tea-drinking competitions. Who could create the most unique blend? Bringing together herbs, flavours, and a dash of silliness. Now no one was a poor loser. Either they were gaining wins via delightful concoctions like spicy ginger snap tea, or reminiscing about that infamous night involving too much gin, a slippery floor, and yes, Uncle Reginald. In the end, the Gin Craze drove families to a paradoxically beautiful place. They embraced tea and shared laughter, leading them to rediscover bonds stronger than the sturdiest of gins. They raised cups, not just in casualities of what was sacrificed at the altar of gin, but in jubilations of the warmth found in family ties. Often, what felt like the end was merely the start, recovering forgotten habits and manners, and building anew with only a touch of absurdity and a lot of love. So here's to families, not only surviving the chaos but finding their way back to each other, one cup of tea at a time.